wouldn't let him have that money. That is not a strong legal argument. And then the simplest way to view this is the framers, when they set up our government, they specifically set up these checks and balances, and then they gave the power of the purse to the House of Representatives. There's no way in my mind they would have allowed the president to bypass that very specific power given to the House of Representatives simply by having the president declare a national emergency. That would basically essentially usurp that entire power of appropriations of the House of Representatives. So we feel pretty strongly on that legal argument as well. But even the president can, let's say, win on that national emergency argument, on the law and on the facts. He then faces a secondary argument, which is all this lets him do is he can then access various statutes, a limited number of them that lets him redirect money. What these statutes actually say is that if you're going to declare national emergency and then direct money from one Department of Defense project to another, it has to be done in support of the armed forces. So it's hard to say that actually it's currently not legal for the armed forces to enforce immigration laws. That's why we have an entire Customs and Border Patrol entity. And if you look at various previous emergency declarations, none of them would be to enforce using DOD money to enforce, which is essentially domestic law. So he would run into that problem as well. And then another statute says, okay, if you're going to redirect these funds, it's got to be for an authorized civil work. Well, if Congress just specifically didn't authorize all these billions of dollars for that civil work, I think it's hard for a court to find that, in fact, somehow this was an authorized work for him to then build the additional wall with that money. And then the last point I'm going to make on this is, let's say the president wins on all those arguments. At the end of the day, he will be able to do this one time. He will be able to use an additional $6 billion or so of this funding, which will get him approximately 1/10 of his $60 billion wall. And then Congress, from now on, will write in every single appropriations bill, none of this can be used for the wall, notwithstanding national emergency. So that's it. He can, even if he wins all this, he will only get this much. So that's what the administration is faced with. And by the way, lastly, the last pot of money he's going after is military construction, a bunch of which helps military families. So, no one actually ever said, hey, let's go out and hurt military families until this administration came along. So that's what we're looking at. They're going to take money from military families, money from drug and addiction, to then try to build this wall. So we think we're right on the facts, right on the law. So we'll see what happens. And then let me conclude on Yemen. So one of the problems with this issue that I've worked on since 2015 is no one has any idea what Yemen is, right? So if you just walk around and said, Yemen, people might go, okay, is that a candy? Is it a rock band? Like, what is it? So it's this country that borders Saudi Arabia, and there's been a raging civil war since 2015. I don't have a philosophical problem with the United States helping our allies. Saudi Arabia is an ally. What I do have a problem with is when our ally engages in what are war crimes. So in 2015, reports started coming out in various newspaper articles that the Saudi-led military coalition were doing airstrikes on civilians nowhere near military targets. When I was active duty in the Air Force, one of the things I did is I taught the law of war, also known as the law of armed conflict. I would read these articles and I would think this looks like a war crime. So I wrote a letter at that time about this then very little known war in Yemen to the Pentagon saying, hey, what's the deal with this? Why are we supporting this coalition? What's our national security interests? And why are they engaging in what look like war crimes? Because our personnel are in that kill chain. We were refueling these Saudi jets at the time. In 2016, I authored legislation and then worked with other members of Congress. And the pressure that we put on the Obama administration at the time caused the administration to stop a shipment of precision-guided munitions to Saudi Arabia. By the way, this is not a partisan issue. This started under a Democratic president. It continues under a Republican president. So under the Obama administration, Now, we put all this pressure on the administration, and they stopped this shipment. And you might wonder, well, why would you want Saudi Arabia to have more accurate munitions? Because it turned out it wasn't that these Saudi jets were trying to hit, let's say, a moving truck, and they missed and struck civilians. It turned out they were intending to strike the targets that they intended to strike. So there was this very large funeral in Yemen, all attended by civilians. These Saudi jets came in, struck it, and hundreds of people got killed or were injured. Then the jets came around again and struck the same exact location. So the Obama administration figured out, okay, these are very precise strikes on civilians. So in addition to funerals, they have struck wedding parties, civilian markets, hospitals, schools, and last year they struck a bus holding over 40 kids. And the Saudis publicly came out and said, yes, they intended to strike that bus. We were very pleased we were able to stop that one shipment. Unfortunately, the current administration has reversed. So what we did, or actually what I did last year, is after doing as much as I could through legislation, press releases, press conferences, and so on, and finally I wrote a letter to the Department of Defense Inspector General of the Pentagon. In that letter, I said this is not an action I wanted to take, but I felt like I was just out of options. And it basically asked for an investigation to see if U.S. personnel were aiding and abetting in war crimes. So this was last August, because again, we're refueling these jets that we know are striking civilians, and to me, we're part of the same chain. And under international law and the law of war, you can be guilty of aiding and abetting war crimes. So we launched that letter last August. A few months later, very pleased that the Trump administration announced they are going to stop refueling Saudi jets in Yemen. So hopefully that will stay. And then just 2 weeks ago, we passed off, actually maybe been last week, we passed off the House floor the first time in many, many years, a war powers resolution that basically instructs the administration to completely pull out of Yemen. So that House resolution is exactly the same thing the U.S. Senate passed on a bipartisan basis last December. So it's our hope that the Senate will now take this and then pass that to the president. And at the end of the day, it's not just war crimes that are happening. It's also, you've got an unreliable ally, right? So you now have Saudi Arabia that lured a U.S. resident into one of its embassies, tortured and murdered the person, and then cut them up into little pieces, and then lied to Congress and American people for 17 days about what they did. So that has gotten members on a bipartisan basis pretty riled up. But in addition to that, you have the largest humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen. You have about half the country about to go into famine. You have people that are starving. You have people that can't get basic drugs for diabetes, for other diseases that they will die of if they don't get this medication. So it is a monumental disaster, and our country is playing a role in it, and I just think that is wrong. So we're just trying to get the U.S. to extricate itself from Yemen, and we have bipartisan support. So hopefully you know some about Yemen. If you want to learn more, you can read about it through the internet and so on, but just not a topic that a lot of people talk about. So with that, don't want to depress all of you. So I'm going to end on some happier notes, which is that our economy is doing well, and that is a good thing. And it's a good thing that we can put more people back to work. I believe, and this has been stated many times before me, that the best social welfare program is a good job. So thank you for what you all do in helping that. And thank you again for having me here, and look forward to working with all of you as we make the South Bay an even better place to live, work,